Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. The Ghost Wore White Pants. Going through elementary school, my brother and I lived in a high ranch house with my parents. We liked to sneak out of our bedroom late at night and look into the refrigerator, explore the house, and just feel like we were being adventurous because we should have been in our rooms asleep. One night before my brother and I went to bed, we both agreed we would sneak out that night. Looking back at the experience, it is strange that we both came out of our bedrooms that night at the exact same time, ready to explore. First, we went into the kitchen, just checking out what there was to snack on. We decided to stand by the railing upstairs, leading down the staircase to the den, when all of a sudden we heard a noise downstairs. Eager to check out what was going on, we went into the playroom to get weapons, aka toys, that we can use to protect ourselves. I ran upstairs and grabbed my wooden pole I kept beneath my dresser to protect myself in case of robbers, and my brother grabbed a hockey stick. The playroom was downstairs and connected to our laundry room. My brother went into the laundry room and opened up the closet, and I heard, "Gina, run!" We scurried upstairs and went into the room. I asked him what he saw. He said, "A man with green glowing eyes and white pants." We crazy kids decided to go back downstairs. Thinking back now, it was almost like we were called to do this. There was a huge closet underneath the stairway that was connected by one big door and then wrapped around to a little door on the other side, so you can get in both ways. The strange part was, almost subconsciously, we knew this, whatever it was, had to be under the stairs. So I took my pole and hit the stairs, pretending that we were walking up and down the stairs to scare him and make him come out. I also pretended that we had a lot of brothers and sisters as well. This way this thing knew he was outnumbered. We eventually decided to look into the closet. I was on the end where the closet door was bigger and looked around to see if we could find anything. All of a sudden, I see a knee with white fabric, pants, around the bend of the closet. So I took my pole and hit it as if it was a pool stick hitting a pool ball, and it slowly moved around the bend until it wasn't visible any longer. At that point, I ran upstairs and said, "Daddy, Daddy, someone is in the house." My dad ran downstairs along with my mother, and they found no trace of anything. My father checked the whole house before he left for work that morning. Afterwards, we all decided that there was nothing to worry about, and we started getting ready for school. My mother was making breakfast upstairs in the kitchen, which had a window that had an entire view to the backyard. The downstairs den, where the closet was, had sliding glass doors leading into the backyard as well. My brother heard a sliding glass door slam shut and knew that he could see the backyard from upstairs if he jumped on the kitchen counter, and he saw a man in white pants walking quickly across the lawn, through the backyard, over the fence, and disappear into the distance. To this day, I think that it was a ghost because my parents could not see this, only we could. The fact that we as elementary school children were being directed towards this energy and just knowing where he was in the house was weird in itself. I did speak to a psychic to try to uncover the mystery, but I'm not sure if she was legit. She told me he died in the house and he was trying to find something he left in the closet. But is that true? I don't know. Years afterwards, my parents had divorced and we were living there with my mother. I was in the kitchen playing a video game facing the opposite direction of the cabinets when I see a flash in the corner of my eye, almost like lightning. It went from one side of the room to the other. I looked back and I didn't see anything. There was another thing that happened to me when I was younger, such as before I could swim in our old house. I told my mother as she was going inside the house that I wanted to dive into the pool one more time with the tube. I jumped in and fell through the tube. I was on the bottom of the pool and walked to the ladder with no struggle to breathe, and the fact that you can't walk on the bottom of the pool is a mystery in itself. I used to have very vivid dreams about flying around my house. I also had this one dream that seemed almost real, that I rose above my bed and saw my whole body and then just dropped and felt the bang on my back. I also had dreams of people coming into my room every night or in the morning and bite me at least once. I had dreams where my dollhouse lit up, and the dreams were very real, almost like I was awake. But at the end of the day, I still don't know who was the ghost with the pants on. The Schoolhouse Ghost. In the mid 1980s, I was a 10-year-old scout. The hut where we had our meetings at the time was behind an old building that used to be part of a school complex, abandoned and boarded up. To get to the hut, I had to walk around the entire left-hand side of the old school. It was a hot midsummer evening, and I was not thinking of anything other than getting to the scout meeting. And as I reached the far left-hand side of the school, I suddenly heard piano music. The music stopped me in my tracks because I could not figure out where it was coming from. The school was far enough away from the adjacent council estate, and there were only playing fields all around. I thought then that it could only be coming from the abandoned school. I decided to put my head against one of the boarded up windows, and sure enough, the music was coming from the other side. I strained to hear what was being played, but I could not make out a recognizable tune, even though the sounds seemed to have some order and were quite pleasant. Anyhow, I thought nothing more of it, and seeing as I was now late for my scout meeting, I left. The next day on impulse, I asked the caretaker of the primary school that formed part of the school complex, still in use as a school, whether anybody had been messing around with the piano in the old school. He looked at me funny and said that the place was completely empty, and that there was certainly no piano that had been left in there. The old school was subsequently renovated and turned into a community center, and by the 1990s was thriving. I had gone to university in Canterbury, and on returning for a visit, I was surprised to be told by my mom that the community center was rumored to be haunted. I asked Mom where specifically, and she answered it was mostly over in the left-hand side of the school. She then told me how, when she had gone to that school as a girl, she remembered that that area used to be the music room. Up to the present, local ghost clubs have visited the school, soon to be demolished to make way for a new academy, and reports continue of poltergeist activity and dark shapes being seen, almost exclusively in the area of the music room. I visited the area many times subsequently, and it certainly retained an atmosphere. I thought I should, in the light of the whole thing being demolished, tell this story. But in truth, nobody really knows who is making that music. A ghost named Henry. When my Aunt Denise was 5 years old, she was sitting in her dining room at my grandmother's house eating lunch. She then looked into the living room and saw a man sitting on the couch. She said the man had a grim, almost angry face. She ran to get her mother, but when she got back, the man was gone. A few years later, she found out that 10 years before my grandparents bought the house, around 1930 or 1940, a man had been killed there. She also found that no police report had been filed, but after speaking to some of the older people in town, concluded that the murderer was closely related to many of the people working at the police station. Some years later, she was told by her younger sisters the story of the man, who she now calls Henry. Her older sister, Donna, yelled at her saying that the story was ridiculous and to stop scaring the younger girls. In her room, Donna had a fairly large picture of Eleanor Roosevelt hanging over her bed. Later that night, while she was sleeping, the picture fell on top of her. She wasn't injured, the picture was fine, and the nail that the picture had been hanging on was perfectly intact. Many, many years later, while he was lying in his bed, my cousin started to tell his mother what he'd seen in my grandmother's house. Since he was very young, there was a certain room he always refused to enter. He now told his mother there was a man in that room. He also described the man as grim and angry, but said that he knew the man wasn't specifically mad at him. Many other people, including myself, have gotten a very eerie feeling while in or on the property of the house. In recent years, after the death of my dear grandmother, the house was sold, knocked down, and rebuilt. My mother believes that because the original house is gone, Henry is finally able to rest in peace, or at least we hope he does. A ghost named Charlie. I grew up in a haunted house in Massachusetts. I still live there today. My dad had bought a trailer and put it on the land. It used to be a junk car lot. He had made a lot of additions to it, so it was a big house when he was done. My house was haunted by an old man whose name was Charlie. We found this out because one day when my parents were building our fireplace and my uncle went in to get something to drink, he saw an old man in farmer jeans just standing there in front of the fireplace with his arms crossed over his chest, shaking his head. My uncle was scared and ran outside and then told us exactly what he looked like. We told our friends next door, and they had a picture of the guy and said that he used to live on the land. It was the same guy that my uncle had seen, and they told us that his name was Charlie and that he had died in a fire. We had noises at night, banging and so on, and the feeling of being watched. The TV and radio would turn on and off by itself. One day, the saw down in the cellar turned on by itself when we were sitting together having supper. My mother said she heard something in the cellar and my dad didn't believe her at first. Then he went down there and it was on. With this saw, you have to pull a lever up to turn it on, so it was really freaky. Charlie didn't like my dad, whose name was also Charlie. I think it was because my dad was mentally abusive to my mother and sometimes to us. He would hide his tools on him all the time, and my dad would go out and buy more tools just to have the old ones show up again in the spot that he had first left them. One time my sister and I heard the dogs barking, so we looked outside and saw the latch go up on the gate. Then the gate opened and closed and the latch went back down with no one there. Another time I was going down the hallway to go to the bathroom, and our dog wanted to get out of my sister's room because it was scratching at the door. I asked my sister if she wanted me to let her out, and she said no because she was scared and wanted her in there. Well, she had a sliding door, and right before my eyes, the door slid open, and the door walked right out. She yelled at me until I told her I didn't do it. Then she made me stay with her because she was even more scared. Another time, the dogs were barking. This was late at night, and this was in the winter after new snow had fallen. The next day, my dad went out to see if there were any footprints in the snow, because the dogs were just going crazy the night before, and all he found was one set of prints, looking into our dining room window. My dad was in the army, and when he was in Germany, he was talking to this lady, and he said he was from Pepperell, and she said she knows Pepperell really well, and he told her our address, and she said, "You bought that place? That place is haunted." My dad was like, "You don't have to tell me that." She said when it was a junk car lot that the cars would be moved around and they would be in different places in the yard and no one had moved them. That was alive anyway. The people next door had asked my mother what my father was doing up in the barn at night, and she's like, "Nothing, why?" And they said they had seen lights on and someone up there walking around. There is no electricity in the barn. I wasn't afraid of him because when I was little and having nightmares, I went into my mom and dad's bedroom with my pillow and blanket and laid on the floor because I didn't want to wake them up. I was still scared because of the nightmares that I had, and then I felt a hand on my back at first, and I was afraid because there was no one there. But then I felt safe, as if I knew he was trying to make me feel better and comfort me when I fell asleep. Our ghost Charlie liked to scare my sister, though, for some reason, and really didn't like my dad. One time he was sleeping and he said he felt something on top of him, and then it started to strangle him. My dad couldn't get up and he started to cry because he was so scared. He held on to the cross he was wearing and started praying, and then it went away. My mother and father got divorced and he came down to visit us and was going to sleep on the couch but didn't want to stay out there alone. He said the ghost doesn't like me. Can one of you sleep out there on the other couch? I said, "You big baby, I'll sleep out there with you." Well, sometime late at night or early morning, I'm not sure, we woke up to something banging on our door. It was so loud that I thought our door would be broken down. I said, "You go get that, Dad." He said, "Hell no, you get it." Of course, we both didn't go to the door. When it finally stopped, we both looked out and didn't see anyone leaving. My mother had someone pray over our house, so Charlie finally has gone into the light. I almost kind of miss him. We still have Charlie's picture of him in his farmer jeans. And I hope, though, that there weren't any other ghosts besides Charlie. The Ghost in the Driveway. I will start by explaining that we migrated from England to Australia in 1961. We were 10 quid tourists and spent 3 weeks in a hostel until we negotiated to buy a house. The house was built on old farmland. Apart from sheep, jawbones, and discarded horseshoes, there was nothing remarkable in the area. I was 6 years old at the time. Not long after moving in, we began to be bothered, in my mother's case, annoyed, by a dark figure passing by the kitchen window. The kitchen was situated directly beside the driveway. We would go outside to see who was sneaking down the driveway and would find no one. This continued intermittently for about 10 years and stopped suddenly after one of our dogs died. This, of course, may have been a coincidence. We had all seen the figure, although my father insisted in later years that he only saw something indistinct. He put it down to his imagination. The odd thing is that what I saw and what my mother saw were two different things. I used to see a totally black shape of a man, as indeed did my two brothers. My mother insisted it was the black shape of a man but wearing a white t-shirt. The figure was not frightening, just a little unsettling. What it was, I can only guess at. If I was pressed for an explanation, I'd say it may have been a stone tape, a non-sentient image recorded in the fabric of the ground. Furthermore, I do not think it would have been captured on film. Due to the disparity in description, I'm inclined towards the idea that it was a hallucination, not implying that we were mad, but that it registered in our minds rather than through our eyes. Nothing terrifying, no clanking chains, nor bed sheets, just a dark figure passing by that stopped appearing when our old dog died. A ghost sighting. I'm a police officer for a major university in Ohio. In the spring of 2002, I was working third shift and it was a slow night. I responded to our large library to check my email. The library I speak of has a very large and open main floor, with floors above it that are more sectioned off. The main floor is the fourth floor. The floors below them are actually the floors of the parking garage that is all part of the building. Years ago, the library was completely shut down and most of the lights would be turned off. There are now housekeepers cleaning overnight 5 days a week, and the lights are now almost on 24 hours. When I was on the floor above the main floor, which is the 5th level, I had that feeling of being watched. The lights were completely out on the 5th floor with only the light of the computer screen and an exit sign in the distance illuminated the area where I was at. As I was sitting down on the computer, I turned around in my seat to see a white male wearing a white shirt and dark short hair standing at a door approximately 20 feet away. I turned around back to the computer and quickly grabbed my flashlight, then spun around quickly to shine the light on the subject. When I shined my light, he was gone. I thought it was a fellow officer on my shift trying to be funny because the subject resembled him. Remember, it was dark, and at that time our uniform shirts were white. I sprang up from my chair and walked over to the area where I saw him and said something like, "Haha, asshole, very funny." I was assuming I would see the officer come from behind something and either say boo or start laughing, but there was no one around. At this point, I now ruled out a fellow officer and now suspected that someone was in the library after hours that shouldn't be there. It was about 3:30 a.m. I announced that I saw them and that they better show themselves or go to jail. Still no answer. I was now taking the situation a little more seriously and drew my weapon, holding my flashlight while performing a search. I announced a few more times for the subject to show themselves, and then called for additional officers to respond to assist in performing a building search. 3 other officers responded, including the officer I thought was playing a joke on me. We performed the building search for about 20 minutes or so. There are a lot of small areas to hide in, and cleared the entire area, finding nothing. After we cleared the building, I told the officers who or what I saw and questioned the officer I thought I saw in the library. He insisted he wasn't there, and another officer verified him, stating that he was with them on the other side of the campus. After that incident, I endured years of teasing. I know what I saw and was confident that I saw someone. After the incident, I completely analyzed the area and came to the conclusion that it was humanly impossible to be able to vanish from sight that quickly. Even if a person was to dive from the doorway, they would have made some kind of noise and could not vanish from sight that quickly. This past August, an officer came up to me and told me to talk to another officer about the ghost I saw in the library. He advised me that the person she saw fit the same description as the one I saw that night years ago. The next night, I talked to the officer that had the sighting, and she stated that she was on the fourth level of the same library on the computer at about 2 a.m. when she looked over and saw a male, white, slim build, wearing a white shirt and short dark hair and dark pants. When she saw him, she sprang up from the computer chair, walked over to him, asking him to come over to her. When she got up, the subject walked over to the corner of the building, walked around the bookcase, then vanished. She became quite startled and left immediately. When I asked her about the situation, she had some relief that I saw the same thing, but it was obvious that talking about it made her upset. She also said that second to her seeing him, she felt the feeling that she was being watched. She stated that it was not possible for someone to just vanish from the general area she was in. At the time, she was going to call for additional officers, but chose not to for the fear of being ridiculed. She and I are the only two officers that have actually seen someone. Two other officers have said that when in the library by themselves, they had that hair on the back of the neck standing up feeling, and that they thought that they were being watched. All four of us admitted that we do not like going into the library after hours by ourselves, which is pretty impressive considering that cops don't like to admit that they're scared of anything. I've also heard of students, faculty, and staff making comments that they get creepy feelings when in the library. I did do a little research on the university and hauntings. There is a known ghost story that a library is haunted by a long-dead professor. The only problem are that the stories are in a completely different library. The library the stories come from is a small library that holds extremely old and rare books, some dating back to the 1600s. I've been in that library many times, and even though the building is very old, I've never felt anything creepy about the area. The subject the two of us saw was not transparent, didn't float, or anything of the ghostly nature. The person we saw looked very real. When it comes to the paranormal, I personally think about 95% of the stories are complete BS. I consider the rest of the 5% as simply unexplainable. I will admit that what I saw was certainly in that 5%. Haunted house in Nebraska. My story begins in a house located in Nebraska about 9 years ago. A few weeks before my 16th birthday, my family moved to a new house. I really liked this house, and it was in our price range, and it was huge. We should have known something was wrong with it. Anyway, a couple of weeks after we moved in, I was sitting in our dining room, which had a motion light that turned on every time someone walked into the room. My bedroom was connected to the dining room. My back was to the door, and I could feel someone was staring at me. When I turned, there was a mist there. In a second, it disappeared. I blew it off. A number of things happened like that, but nothing compared to what I am about to tell you. The next night, my oldest sister couldn't sleep in her room because it was too cold. She decided it would be a good idea to sleep on the couch. Our dad got off work around 1:30 a.m. because he worked at a bar. Every night he would walk through the front door, through the living room and dining room, and to the kitchen to make his dinner. Then he would go down to his room in the basement. That night, he saw my sister sleeping on the couch. When he tried to talk to her, she snapped at him and told him to leave her alone. She had to be at work at 6:15 a.m. So my dad left her alone and made his dinner and went downstairs. Around 2:30 a.m., she couldn't sleep, so she turned on the TV. She covered her head and started to drift off. Then she heard what she thought was our dad coming up the stairs. She was ticked off because she knew he was going to bug her. Only he walked by her and went up the stairs to the top floor. The whole time he was going up the stairs, he was tapping on the wall. It was weird he would go upstairs since the only thing up there was our other sister who was passed out. A few seconds later, she heard him come back down. Again, the whole time he was tapping. When he got to the couch he was on, he leaned over, taking a closer look. She knew this was happening because the light from the TV was blocked. After a little while, he stood up and went back downstairs. About 20 minutes later, the same thing happened. My sister was about to yell at him when she remembered we now had a motion light. The light would have come on if it was our dad. Instead of the thing going downstairs this time, it continuously walked up and down the flight leading to the upper floor, still tapping away. It progressively got faster and louder until it stopped all of a sudden. My sister just stayed frozen on the couch until she saw sunlight and heard my door open. My sister doesn't lie about this type of stuff, so when she told me, I believed her. It seems pretty far-fetched, but it happened. A few weeks later we moved, not because of the ghost, but because the person who owned the house died and her family wanted to sell it. They came clean about the ghost when we moved. Even though it was haunted, I would move back. The house we live in now is haunted too, but that's another story. The haunting in Virginia. My grandmother told me this when I was young. It always scared the crap out of me because I know my grandmother is not one to make things up. My grandparents were married in 1942 when my grandmother was only 17. They both were born and raised in Southwest Virginia in the mountains, and neither were very wealthy. They were very lucky when my grandmother's father found them a place to start their new life together. The house was old and had been abandoned for a number of years, but when you're young and poor, you take what you get. My great-grandfather promised my grandfather to help him fix the place up. It was livable, though, with a good cleaning, so things like loose floorboards, old cabinets, and the old chimney could be fixed a bit at a time. The new couple settled down for their first night in their new home, but my grandmother could not sleep. She kept hearing a baby crying. It was faint at first, so she thought maybe it was a rabbit that had been caught by an owl, but the minute she tried to roll over, the sound got louder and more urgent. She couldn't figure out for the life of her where it was coming from. The old house was secluded, so their nearest neighbor was a good 5 miles away. She woke my grandfather, who heard it too. He went outside thinking maybe some poor woman had left her baby, but they could find nothing. The crying was definitely coming from within the house. Night after night, they were either awakened by the crying or it started before they could even get to sleep. My grandmother went to visit a sick friend of hers, mother's, in town. When the lady made a comment about how tired my grandmother seemed, my grandmother said they hadn't been sleeping well in their new house. The lady asked why. My grandmother said that they kept hearing the crying. Her mother's friend asked where the house was. When my grandmother told her, she said she went deathly pale. Well, Ruth, I know that house. That's a sad house. A family from our church lived there, a young couple with a newborn baby. The man was having a hard time of it. His crops weren't doing well, and he had nothing at all to feed his family. They were a proud family and wouldn't take anything. He went hunting one day and was supposed to be back before dark. He never showed up for supper. Days and days went by, then weeks. One Sunday we didn't see the woman and child in church. We went to check on her only to find her dead in a rocker. The sight was horrible. She had killed herself with her husband's gun, leaving a letter saying she thought he had left her, leaving her so hungry and alone. Her husband was found dead only a few miles up the mountain the next year. He had broken his leg and had been unable to get help. The strange thing was no one ever found that sweet baby. My grandmother shivered at the story, but she wasn't going to let that story scare her away from her home. She went home and went about her day forgetting to tell my grandfather the story. The crying still continued. About a week later, my grandmother had went to stay with her parents to be able to get some rest. She took some dinner to her father and husband the one afternoon and sat and ate with her. They asked her to stay a bit to sweep up while they pulled some old broken bricks from the chimney, since it was getting cooler and they knew they would need the fire soon for the heat. The men pulled a few bricks before my grandfather exclaimed, "What the heck is this?" He pulled out a small box about the size of a shoebox. Inside were the tiny charred bones of a baby. My grandmother cried and told the men the story her mother's friend had told her. The next day, they gave the baby a proper burial and never heard the crying again. The Ghost with the Suspenders. We bought a house in 1995 on August 23rd. Ironically, this was also happened to be my husband's birthday. The happenings were subtle at first. I would be in the basement and I would see dark shadows move quickly across the wall about 3 feet off the floor. I tried to dismiss it as nothing because it was a while before anything else happened. It was a few months later when all hell broke loose. I was lying in bed and I awoke to feel a hand on my forehead. You can imagine the frozen state I was in. I didn't breathe, I didn't move. I just wanted to know who was there. The only other thing I experienced in that bedroom was someone sitting on top of me and that I had trouble breathing. I was the only one, or so I thought, that had experienced anything paranormal. My youngest son, who has special needs, would call out, "Mommy, Mommy, don't let the ghosts get me." My oldest son had heard someone call his name in the basement. My dad had on 2 occasions felt someone touch his shoulder in the basement as well. Other events that have happened in the basement where a CD player was thrown into the floor upside down. It wasn't plugged in, however, it started to play. Lights would flicker off and on. The cats would stare at the same spot. The dryer was opened and all the clothes were thrown onto the floor. And the worst, which was a deep sense of not being alone. When I sit at the computer, which is in the basement, I always feel like someone is hovering, just looking over my shoulder. Just the other day, I felt a cold draft blow over my arms. My oldest son has seen a large figure shadow move through the door. Upstairs is where I became the most scared. I would be in my son's bedroom, kneeling on the floor, and someone would pull up my clothes at my waist very hard. This happened a few times. In the bathroom, someone would play with my hair, and in the kitchen, chairs would be moved. And that's where I saw him, my dirty ghost. He was a 3rd stage ghost, where I only saw his torso. He wore a dirty undershirt, suspenders, dirty worn green work pants, and had a big belly. I was scared shitless. I still feel like someone is always with me. At one time, my ghost actually traveled with me to another town and kept tapping on my shoulder. What I really want to know is who this is and what does he have in store for me. I mean, we lived near a historical area where the War of 1812 took place. But considering how I saw that he was dressed, I really don't think that he's from there. He just looks like maybe the plumber's ghost? Deal with the devil. I live in a small town south of St. Louis, and I live on private land. I was raising my 3 sons and 3 stepsons. Believe me when I say raising all boys is a challenge, but not the challenge I had thrown at me within a few weeks. I received a call from a neighbor one morning asking that I go up to the high school with her to confront the principal on the fact that they were getting ready to take computer time away from her daughter and my son for researching devil worship on the school's computers. I was outraged at this and was ready to fight. On the car ride with the other mother, I began to hear she was starting to have problems with her daughter and strange behavior that she was exhibiting. I began to wonder if this had anything to do with my son. No, not my son, I thought. Well, I was in a meeting with the principal and I was learning what was to become a frightening fight with the devil. I was amazed to learn my son was researching such things and was researching it just a little too much. After the meeting, I went home and went straight to his room. I began to ransack my son's room looking for anything that could lead me to what in the heck was going on. He was 16 and I felt as if I was not supposed to invade his privacy. But this mother needed answers since my son was not talking. I found tarot cards and also some hardback books that contained rituals for summoning guardians and all kind of dark things. I could not translate the words in the book, but my son knew them all too well. I took everything I could find, threw them in a pile, and burned them. Well, the kids had one chore to do when they come home. Then they had the evening to get homework studies done, and then the evening was theirs. I heard my oldest son slamming the dishes around into the dishwasher. I went to the kitchen to ask him to stop. He grabbed me by both wrists and growled at me to leave him alone, and that no one was going to tell him what to do ever again. I yelled at him to take a walk and calm down. He made a call to the police department, telling them to get to our house because he was getting ready to hurt his mom. That is what started what I am about to tell you. I did not learn until Christmas of 2009 what my son actually had done to his family in this house. I was sitting up late one night with all the lights off watching TV, waiting to put the wood in the wood furnace to keep heat in the house while everyone slept. I heard the faucet in the kitchen come on and heard sounds as if someone was drinking water. I asked who was up, retrieved myself from the recliner, and went to the kitchen in a matter of minutes, but no one was there. Now let me remind you, I did not know about my son and his devil activities until later, after all these things happened. I went to the furnace and stoked the fire and came back in from the blistering cold and went to bed. A few nights later, I shut the house down and fell asleep again. I went and tucked all the boys in with extra blankets and picked up their things from the floor and went to bed. I had been asleep about 35 minutes according to the clock, when all at once I was awakened by a presence standing beside my bed. It felt strange and very evil. I was afraid to open my eyes, afraid of what I might see. I lay there for about 10 minutes, then decided to count to 5 and jumped to turn on the light to see that no one was there. I felt very uneasy at what I had felt. I ran to the 3 other bedrooms, checking on the kids to see that not one of them had moved from their position from when I tucked them in with blankets before retiring. The whole time I was walking back to my room, I felt as if I was not alone. I crawled back into bed and snuggled very close to my husband and lay there for about 30 minutes before I fell asleep again. The next day, my second oldest son came to me and said, "Mom, there's a man looking at me from the window." Now mind you, the window was about 10 feet off the ground. We looked and there were no tracks in the snow outside the window. Another time I was putting firewood in the furnace and I saw a man walk across the wide open yard in the dark, but when I took a second glance, no one was around. I was having a gathering of some friends from church when I was talking to a preacher on the front deck of the same house. About 6 months later, I saw him look over my shoulder and gaze with his eyes as if he was watching someone. I looked behind me to see nothing, but asked him what he was looking at. He just shook his head and said he'd seen something and it was not of God. If that was not enough, I have gone through a divorce and abuse before the divorce from a man that never would have hurt me before. The abuse got worse and the fights got bigger. I stayed in a depressed mode all the time. Now that I have remarried and lived away from that dark, evil home, my life is great. I am married to a wonderful man. I am living happily. At Christmas, I received a Christmas card from a church friend from that town, and she told me something that totally freaked me out. This was about 7 years later, and keep in mind I was embarrassed about my oldest son messing around with the devil research and playing around with that crap, so I told no one at all about what had happened. This friend began to tell me that my ex-husband was renting to several different families. One family moved into the house in May, and the following November the same year they left. Her daughter had a friend that was moving in, and she was watching them move furniture in and saw this big black mass that she describes to be a demon in the doorway. She was very certain that she saw this. I know the evil I felt while I was living there. I talked to my second oldest son after talking to this old friend from that town. He told me things that sent a chill right up my spine. He told me he watched his older brother summon a guardian to protect and watch over himself. My second oldest son began to tell me how his older brother had wanted his younger brother to start learning and reading these books, but he refused to be a part of it. I asked a few people who have authority in this area to find out what my son may have done behind closed doors that may have invited whatever that is into that house. This story is true. I lived it. Now, what has happened to the oldest son? His life is really messed up, and all bad follows him wherever he goes. As my second eldest son said, something latched onto him, and it's not letting him go. And I feel that there's nothing that I can do about that.